They said a few coins couldn't buy anything worth keeping, certainly not a future. But when a penniless cowboy pressed his last handful of change into the palm of an old landowner, he walked away with nothing more than a broken barn and the dust of his failures trailing behind him. Beside him stood his only companion, a scarred Mustang who refused to leave. What followed was not the rebuilding of wood and nails alone, but of spirit, memory, and family. Out of ruin rose something no one in Dust Hollow expected to see again: hope. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Caleb Rowan was past 40, though the years had not been kind to him. Once his frame had carried the lean strength of a man accustomed to the saddle, toughened by long days under the sun and endless miles trailing cattle. Now his shoulders slumped with a heaviness that came not only from age, but from the weight of disappointments he could never quite set down. His shirt, once a proud starched white, was faded to the color of old parchment torn at the cuffs. The brim of his hat sagged where the felt had been worn thin, and the leather of his boots split at the heels, opening like tired mouths. His face bore the story of his decline. The sharp planes of youth had given way to hollows beneath the cheekbones, and a rough stubble shadowed his jawline, never quite trimmed, never quite clean. His eyes, though dulled by fatigue, still held a flicker of something stubborn, an ember of pride, perhaps, or simply the refusal to bow completely to defeat. Around Dust Hollow and the towns beyond, Caleb had once been known a steady hand. With horses, a man you could count on to drive a herd through storms and rivers. But seasons of bad luck and worse choices had stripped away that reputation, like bark peeled from a tree. Now when people saw him, they saw only a drifter. Only one creature in the world still looked at Caleb Rowan, as though nothing had changed his Mustang. Ash was a stallion, the color of wet earth, his coat a dark, burnished brown that gleamed almost black in the right light. His mane ran long and untamed, the strands lifting in the wind, as if they carried stories of wild country still clinging to him. He was strong-chested, his legs lean, and sure the kind of horse built to run across open plains until the horizon burned itself away. Caleb had found him years earlier, still half wild, a menace to those who tried to rope him. Taming Ash had been one of the last things Caleb had done that felt like triumph. From that day on, the Mustang had never strayed far. Ash followed Caleb with the quiet loyalty of a companion who asked for no explanations. At night, when the world felt heavy and silence pressed too close, the horse would sidle up, nudging his shoulder with a warm muzzle, as though to remind him he was not completely alone. Sometimes Caleb swore the beast could sense his thoughts, the doubt, the exhaustion, the faint flicker of stubbornness that kept him putting one foot in front of the other. Ash was no mere mount. He was family. And more than that, he was the last proof that Caleb still knew how to win something worth keeping. Together, they wandered the edges of Dust Hollow. The land there was a half-forgotten stretch of country where the earth burned red and dry winds scoured the skin raw. Dust devils twisted across empty fields, and the skeletons of old homesteads leaned into the horizon, their fences broken, their roofs collapsed. The sun baked everything it touched, while nights fell cold and vast beneath skies crowded with stars. Caleb and Ash traced those lonely roads. Sometimes they found a creek to follow for a mile or two, sometimes a patch of mesquite where they could rest in the shade. Most nights they lay beneath the open sky, Caleb with a thin blanket pulled over him, using Ash's saddle as a pillow. The Mustang would graze until the dark swallowed him, then return to stand near, head bowed, ears flicking at the night sounds. Meals were whatever Caleb could scrounge: hardtack on stale canned beans that rattled in his pack, a crust of bread from a sympathetic grocer if luck was kind. Water came from the tin canteen he refilled at wells or from clear trickles down in dry washes. Each swallow was measured like coin, counted carefully from an almost empty purse. Life had narrowed into something sparse, stripped of every comfort except the rhythm of hooves and the endurance of his horse. The barrenness of that land mirrored what had become of Caleb's spirit. Every horizon seemed to whisper reminders of what he had lost, each mile traveled echoing the hollowness of his failures. And those failures were never far from his thoughts. He remembered a time when the nights had been filled with laughter, when campfires drew men close as he sang low cowboy ballads, his voice carrying into the darkness. Herds of cattle stretched across valleys under his care, and ranchers nodded with respect when his name was spoken. There was a pride in those days, a certainty that his life was part of something steady and strong. Then came the drought. The rivers shrank, grass turned brittle and yellow, and cattle grew gaunt. One by one, head after head of the herd collapsed under the merciless sun. Caleb fought to save what he could, but debts mounted faster than cattle died. The bank had no mercy. The men he owed demanded what he could never repay. And with the collapse of the ranch came the collapse of everything else. His wife, weary of hardship and of Caleb's stubborn insistence that things would turn around, left. His children grew, choosing distance rather than live in the shadow of their father's ruined pride. They carried away with them the warmth of a home, leaving Caleb in the cold silence of his own stubbornness. Now, years later, the memory of it pressed on him like a wound that never healed. In town, people looked through him, their eyes sliding away, as though his failures might be contagious. Alone by the fire at night, he thought of himself as little more than a shadow, useful to no one, unworthy of the title of father, much less anything more. And yet, despite the weight of regret, something kept him moving. Each dawn he saddled Ash, cinched the worn leather tight, and swung himself into the saddle with the stiffness of a man who refused to stop. He might have been a failure, but he was not ready to lie down and accept the earth over him. The roads into Dust Hollow always felt older than the town itself, as though the ground had grown tired of carrying wagons and boots and now surrendered to dust. After days of wandering, Caleb Rowan and his Mustang Ash finally reached the far edge of that forgotten settlement. The air shimmered with heat, and the land stretched barren and brittle under a relentless sun. The countryside around them told a story of decline. Fence posts leaned like drunkards, their wire long since snapped and rusted. A handful of cabins clung to the outskirts' roofs, sagging inward shutters rattling when the wind pushed through. Beyond them rose low, pale hills, where grass no longer bothered to grow, stripped bare by drought and time. Ash slowed as they passed an empty lot near the edge of town. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring. Caleb pulled on the reins, gently following his horse's gaze. There, crouched against the horizon like a forgotten relic, stood a barn, if stood could be the word for it. The roof had caved in at several points, jagged holes gaping like wounds in the sky. The walls sagged on warped beams, and weeds climbed the sides, as though nature itself had come to bury the place. Around the base, wild grass choked what once might have been a corral. Caleb stared, feeling an odd stir in his chest. He couldn't name it curiosity, perhaps, or some stubborn instinct that told him to stop. Something about the ruin spoke to him, as if the broken boards were whispering secrets he had yet to uncover. For reasons he could not explain, he felt as though he needed to stand there, to look closer, to linger. He was still staring when a voice rasped across the silence. "Not much worth seeing, son." Caleb turned sharply. From a weathered shack nearby, an old man emerged. His hair, once black, had surrendered entirely to silver, hanging in rough waves down to his collar. Though bent with age, his shoulders remained broad, the kind forged by decades, at an anvil rather than in a chair. His hands, even wrapped around the iron cane that supported him, bore the thick calluses of a blacksmith. This was Jedediah Boone. Time had carved trenches into his face, but his eyes stayed sharp, keen, measuring with the flicker of a man who had lived long enough to spot truth and falsehood in equal measure. His voice was gravelly worn, but not weak. He studied Caleb for a long moment, then shifted his gaze toward Ash. The stallion, usually restless with strangers, merely stood still, ears flicking as if acknowledging a kindred spirit. Jedediah nodded once, the kind of gesture that carried more weight than words. The old man broke the silence again. "What brings you nosing around this side of town? Don't get many visitors wasting their time on piles of rot." Caleb kept his tone honest. "Just passing through. Thought I'd take a look." Jedediah barked out a dry laugh that sounded closer to a cough. "A look, eh?" At that he gestured toward the leaning barn. "Ain't nothing there but splinters and dust. Been like that longer than most men in this town been alive. Folks quit caring about it decades back." Caleb didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the barn, drawn to it with a persistence he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way the last light struck the battered boards, or the stubborn way it still stood despite decay. Something in him, a man hollowed out by failure, yet still breathing, saw possibility where others saw only ruin. He tugged off one glove, rubbing sweat from his brow. The motion bared his forearm, and in the fading light, the ink there caught Jedediah's eye. The old man's expression shifted. There, faded but unmistakable, was the mark of the cavalry, a tattoo Caleb had carried since his days serving with the mounted unit. The lines had blurred with age, but the symbol remained a memory carved in skin. Jedediah's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Slowly, almost reverently, he set the tip of his iron cane into the dirt. "Cavalry," he muttered. Caleb looked up surprised. Jedediah tapped his own chest with thick fingers. "I wasn't riding, but I was there. Army smithy back when they needed every hand they could get. Spent my years hammering shoes for horses, fixing buckles and cinches so men like you could ride." For a moment, neither spoke further. They only shared a silence that belonged to men who had once stood in uniform, each carrying memories of dust, steel, and sacrifice. There was no need to explain. The bond of service, seen or unseen, was enough. Jedediah finally shifted his voice, dropping lower. "You want that barn?" Caleb blinked. "What?" The old man tilted his chin toward the ruin. "Take it. I don't need it. Ain't no one else gonna claim it? Been sitting there longer than I care to remember. If it calls to you, it's yours. Only cost you a handful of coins." Caleb let out a hollow laugh. "A handful of coins just so's the deed don't look like charity," Jedediah said with a shrug. Then his voice hardened a steel edge beneath the rasp. "But if you do take it, boy, don't you dare let it rot. Don't let it sink into the ground like a grave. Give it a reason to stand, make it mean something. I know a little about pulling life out of ashes." The words struck Caleb like a challenge thrown across a table. He heard no pity in them, only a test to dare to prove he still had fight in him. Caleb looked down at his belt pouch. He already knew what he would find. Fingers fumbling, he opened it, letting the small clatter of coins fall into his palm. A few nickels, a dime or two, his last. The sound of metal was sharp and cold, each piece a weight heavier than it looked, because together they represented the sum total of what he had left in the world. He stared at them, then at the barn. Something in his chest clenched, then loosened. He stepped forward, hand outstretched. "This is all I've got," he said quietly. "If it's enough, then that barn is mine." Jedediah studied the coins in Caleb's rough hand, then looked him straight in the eye. For a long moment, the air felt heavy with judgment. Then the old man nodded once slow but firm. He extended his hand. Caleb gripped it. The handshake was strong, the calloused grip of one craftsman meeting another. Jedediah's hand, though old, still carried the power of a man who had bent iron to his will. Caleb, scarred and cracked, trembled slightly, but held firm. In that clasp, something passed between them, something more binding than paper or deed. When the coins were pocketed and the bargain made, silence fell again. But this silence felt different, less empty, more charged with possibility. Ash stamped a hoof and gave a low, rumbling nicker, as if acknowledging the deal. Caleb reached out to steady the horse, but the gesture was more for himself, grounding him against the swell of nerves and hope that rose unexpectedly inside. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the faintest flicker of ownership. Not of wealth, not of cattle or land that stretched to the horizon, but of a single roof, a single place that might yet be called his own. And though Caleb would not have dared say it aloud, he felt something dangerous stirring inside him, something he thought he had lost. Hope. The hinges screamed when Caleb pulled on the door. The warped wood resisted at first, then gave with a groan, the rusty metal shrieking, as if the barn itself were protesting against being disturbed. Dust rolled off the frame, drifting into the sunlight in sluggish clouds. Caleb coughed once, shielding his face with an arm before stepping inside. The air hit him like a slap. Dampness, old and heavy, carried the sour tang of rotting straw. The roof above was a jagged lattice of holes, sunlight dripping through in broken shafts, falling across heaps of decay. Straw lay blackened and slick in places, reeking of mold. The walls leaned in, warped and graying, their boards long surrendered to time. At the far end, a support beam slouched like a drunk against the floor, its base chewed away by rot. Patches of the floor were stained dark, spreading out in irregular blooms of mildew. Rusting farm tools lay scattered in corners, shovels, a rake, a broken pitchfork, abandoned relics reduced to orange decay. Caleb stood still in the doorway, his breath shallow, his stomach tightening. The barn seemed less a building and more a monument to ruin, a shrine to abandonment. It mirrored his life with cruel accuracy, splintered, sagging, stripped of dignity, yet somehow still standing. He felt as if he were staring at himself, broken and hollowed out by years of failure. The weight of it pressed down on him. "This is too much," he whispered. His voice sounded small, lost in the cavern of rot. He imagined what it would take to fix such a place, weeks of labor, tools he didn't own, money he didn't have. It felt like staring up at a mountain, only to realize he had no rope, no shoes, and no strength left to climb. The sight dragged him back into memory, those cursed years at the ranch. He had stood just like this once, staring at pastures gone, yellow fences, falling cattle, stumbling with ribs like ladders beneath their skin. Back then, he had told himself he could fight. It told his family to trust him, to wait. Hope had seemed so close, then it had collapsed all the same. The drought had crushed his herd, the bank had taken the land, and his family had looked at him with eyes filled first with fear, then disappointment. And now, here he was again, staring at another hopeless wreck, clutching another promise he wasn't sure he could keep. For a terrible moment, he thought about walking away. He could sell the barn, maybe scrape together a few dollars, though who in their right mind would buy it? He could ride out with Ash, disappear into another town, drift on like he had for years. But then he remembered the weight of the coins he had dropped into Jedediah Boone's hand, the last of everything. He remembered the firm grip of the old man's handshake. "This is all I've got left," Caleb muttered, the words bitter in his mouth. Behind him came the steady rhythm of hooves. Ash stepped through the door without hesitation. The Mustang's ears flicked as he tested the air nostrils flaring. The horse moved with unhurried certainty, his hooves clopping against the warped boards. Each step echoed differently hollow, where the floor had rotted through solid, where the wood still held. He paused at one corner, lowering his head to breathe deep, then turned slowly, examining the space, as though he were the one deciding its worth. Finally, Ash stopped in the middle of the barn. He lifted his head, chest expanding as he drew in a long breath. Sunlight slid across his dark coat, and for a moment he looked larger than he was, steady, sure, alive. Then he turned his head toward Caleb, ears forward, eyes calm. The look was unmistakable. "We begin here," it seemed to say. Caleb blinked, surprised at how solid the thought felt. It was absurd, he told himself, to read intention in a horse's gaze. And yet Ash had been beside him long enough through so much silence that sometimes words felt unnecessary. The stallion's calm in this place of ruin was steadier than any sermon. Caleb let out a long breath. "All right then," he said softly. "All right." He found an old broom leaning against a wall, its handle cracked, bristles splayed, but not useless. Beside it, half buried in straw, lay a rusted shovel. They were pitiful tools for such a task, yet they were something. He started with the floor. Each sweep of the broom raised choking clouds of dust that danced in the light before settling again. The air grew thick, burning his throat, but he kept going, pushing aside the layers of neglect. The shovel clanged dully as he scraped away piles of blackened straw, the rot crumbling in his hands as he tossed it outside. The work was brutal in its simplicity. His back bent, his arms strained, sweat poured down his temples until it stung his eyes. His palms tore open, old calluses ripping to expose tender skin, blood mixing with the dirt. Still he carried on, dragging load after load out into the pitiless sun. Each trip left him gasping, but each return gave him something tangible: space, cleared filth, removed light, finding its way to the floor. Ash watched from inside, tail flicking, ears swiveling. From time to time, the Mustang let out a soft snort, as if to remind Caleb he wasn't alone in this fight. Hours bled together. Caleb lost track of time, measuring progress not in minutes, but in the shrinking piles of decay. He worked until his arms trembled and his breath came in ragged bursts. Finally, after what felt like forever, he stopped. A small corner of the barn lay clean. Sunlight slanted down onto boards he hadn't seen when he first entered, and though they were scarred, they were solid. In that cleared patch, the air smelled less of mold and more of dust and wood. It was almost nothing. Yet it was something. By the time he dropped onto a bale too rotten to keep his body, screamed at him. His shoulders throbbed with strain, his back ached as though it had been hammered, and his hands raw, blistered, bleeding. Barely wanted to curl around the broom anymore. Every muscle in him cried for rest. But inside his skull, for the first time in weeks, there was silence. No echoes of creditors shouting down his failures. No replay of his wife's departure, her face turned away as she left. No haunting memory of Matthew's glare, of Clara's tears of the day. The ranch gates had closed for the last time. The noise of regret and shame had receded, drowned out by the steady rhythm of physical labor. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head hanging between them, and let out a long, shaky breath. His chest hurt from the effort, but it was a pain that felt honest. It was a pain that told him he had done something. He realized slowly that the barn had not yet broken him. Instead, with every rotten bale he dragged into the sun, with every sweep that revealed a sliver of floor beneath the muck, the barn had offered him something unexpected, a kind of therapy. Each stroke of the broom, each scrape of the shovel was like a blow struck against despair. His body might have been battered, but his spirit, some hidden part of it, felt just a fraction lighter. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sweat dust and the steady rhythm of labor. Caleb lost himself in the grind of clearing the barn, hauling out moldy straw, dragging broken beams into the light. His hands were a map of cuts and blisters, his back stiff from bending and lifting. But the work kept his thoughts at bay. At least until the morning came, when he realized he could not continue without a few simple supplies. Nails, rope, a strip of canvas if he was lucky. So he saddled Ash and rode into Dust Hollow. The town was no more than a crooked line of buildings pressed against a dirt road. A general store with a faded sign, a smithy that stank of hot iron, and at the far end, a small post office with peeling white paint. The place had the weary patience of a town that expected nothing new. And Caleb felt his presence like a shadow, cutting across the dust. Ash's hooves rang hollow as he tied him to a post and stepped inside. The postmaster, a man well into his 70s, looked up from a ledger. His face lit with recognition not of Caleb himself, but of his type, a stranger, a drifter, a man who carried the dust of 100 roads on his boots. "You Rowan?" the old clerk asked, fumbling behind the counter. Caleb frowned. "Aye." The man produced a single envelope. "Been sitting here a spell. Thought maybe it'd never find you." Caleb's breath caught. The handwriting across the paper was one he would know anywhere, neat, careful loops that belonged to his daughter Clara. For a moment he could only stare. His hand trembled as he reached out, the envelope suddenly heavier than iron. His chest tightened as though a stone had lodged itself there. He stepped outside with it, the sun glaring so bright he could hardly see. With stiff fingers, he broke the seal. The words inside unfolded like Clara's own voice. She wrote the way she had always spoken, with grace, with a kindness that seemed to spill from her without effort. She spoke of her life in the small town where she had settled her modest job at a dressmaker's shop, the apartment she kept tidy, with curtains she had sewn herself, the friends who made her laugh on Sundays. She spoke of the little things, the ordinary things, as if to assure her father that she had built a world of her own. Then came the line that stole Caleb's breath. "Dad, I have wonderful news. I'm going to have a baby." "You're going to be a grandfather." The words blurred as his eyes filled. He pressed the letter close, his throat aching, his heart pounding with a joy so fierce it frightened him. He could see at Tiny Hand's laughter he had not yet heard a new life that carried his blood into a future he thought had closed its doors on him. For a moment, the world seemed to lift, as though the weight on his shoulders had cracked away. But as quickly as the joy came, despair followed. The images in his mind curdled into shame. A grandfather. What sort of grandfather lived in a ruin that smelled of mold and dust? What did he have to offer a child who deserved warmth and safety? He owned no house, no steady work, not even a proper table to sit at. He had failed as a husband, failed as a father, and now stood on the edge of failing as a grandfather before the child even drew breath. His gaze fell to the barn, waiting at the edge of Dust Hollow. Its crooked frame mocked him, its broken roof whispering the truth. He feared, "You are nothing but ruin." Caleb folded the letter too hard, crumpling it in his fist. A sound tore from him, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but something raw, hollow, stripped bare. The happiness had lasted seconds. What remained was the certainty that he was unworthy of this gift of news. He returned to the barn, his body moving without thought. Inside, the air was cooler shadowed, but the place felt even emptier than before. He lowered himself onto a crate and sat in the dim light, and the letter wrinkled in his hands. His shoulders bowed until his forehead nearly touched his knees. Shame spread through him like water through cloth, soaking every thought. The barn's silence seemed alive, pressing against him each creak of the rafters, a jeer each gust of wind through the broken roof, a mocking laugh. Dust swirled in thin shafts of light, drifting like fragments of everything he had once dreamed and lost. Perhaps he thought Clara and Matthew would be better off without him at all. Perhaps the kindest thing he could do was vanish, completely fade into the horizon like any other nameless drifter. They would not have to carry the burden of his failures. They could raise this new child free of the shadow he cast. For a long time, he sat unmoving, the thought gnawing at him with cruel patience. Then came the sound of hooves shifting. Ash had been standing near the open door, but now he stepped forward, heavy head-lowered ears pricked toward his master. He let out a sharp snort and pawed at the wooden floor. The strike of his hoof rang against the board, steady and rhythmic, once, twice, 3 times. Caleb did not stir. The Mustang pawed again, harder this time, his dark eyes fixed on the man slumped in shadow. He let out a low whicker, soft but insistent, a sound Caleb had heard countless times when the horse wanted him to pay attention. Still no answer. Finally, Ash stomped hard enough that dust rained from the rafters. His ears pointed forward, his gaze unflinching, demanding. Slowly, reluctantly, Caleb lifted his head. His eyes met the horse's. What he saw there was no pity, no doubt, but a deep, steady loyalty that seemed carved into stone. The look said plainly, "I'm still here." "So are you." Caleb drew in a long, ragged breath. His hand reached out, brushing the horse's mane. "You still believe I can do it, don't you, Ash?" His voice cracked on the words. The Mustang breathed warm air across his shoulder, the simple contact pulling Caleb back from the cliff edge of despair. The letters still weighed heavy in his palm. The barn was still broken, the future still uncertain. But in that moment, he was not alone. And as fragile as it was, that was enough to keep him standing. Suddenly, the Mustang pawed once at the ground, then again. Caleb ignored it. But the horse persisted, striking in a steady rhythm, his iron shoes sending hollow notes into the air. Caleb frowned. The sound was different, thinner, emptier, like knocking on a drum. He pushed himself to his feet. "What is it now, boy?" Ash answered with a low nicker, then drove his hoof once more into the corner near the wall. The noise rang sharper this time, undeniably hollow. The horse flicked his ears forward, eyes steady as if urging him dig here. Caleb crouched, pressing his palm to the boards. Beneath the dust and grime, he felt a vibration, a space where there should have been solid earth. His pulse quickened. He found an old spade among the discarded tools and set to work. The ground there was hard with neglect, a crust of packed dirt layered with straw gone black with mold. The spade bit in reluctantly, each thrust sending shocks up his arms. He pried up planks, shoveled out clumps of soil sweat, soaking the back of his shirt. Minutes stretched into an hour. His muscles burned, his blistered palms screamed, but something drove him to keep going, something more than curiosity, as though he were unearthing not just wood and soil, but the truth of the place itself. Then with a metallic clink, the blade struck something solid. Caleb froze. Heart hammering, he cleared more earth, until the outline emerged the edge of a chest. It was small, not much larger than a man's toolbox, but solidly built. Its surface was cloaked in dirt, its corners bound by rusting iron. The lock was broken, eaten away by years. He knelt over it, breath coming fast. He knew enough of the world to recognize that some discoveries were accidents, but this one felt like fate. With trembling hands, he pried the lid open, using the blade of his pocket knife. The seal gave suddenly a gasp of stale air rushing out as dust exploded upward. Caleb coughed, waving it aside, blinking until the shapes inside came clear. They were not gold coins or jewels, not tools or weapons. What lay within was far humbler, yet far more precious. First, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and stiff-tied closed with a string that had nearly frayed to nothing. Beneath it lay a child's saddle so small it might have fit a pony or Mustang foal, the leather softened by years, but still bearing the careful stitching of someone who had worked with love. Beside it rested a folded handkerchief, embroidered with tiny wildflowers in thread, that had faded but not vanished. In the corner, stitched with careful hands, was a single letter M. And finally, slipped beneath them, a letter of its own, folded once its paper yellowed the ink, blurred into soft shadows by time. Caleb sat back on his heels. His throat tightened. The chest did not belong to him yet. Opening it felt like stepping into a stranger's home, uninvited. Still, he lifted the items one by one, cradling them as if they might crumble. Each piece carried the weight of lives lived long before his own. He untied the journal and opened the first page. In faded looping handwriting, a name was written, Margaret Boone. Caleb blinked. Boone? A spark of recognition flared. Jedediah. Could this Margaret have been his kin, a sister, a wife? He turned the page. The entries spilled forward in a voice plain and warm, speaking of days long past. Margaret wrote of building the barn with her husband, of hammering boards, until their hands blistered of the pride that swelled in them as the frame rose against the horizon. She spoke of the first foal born under its roof, of the sweet hay, stacked high, of laughter that filled the air when their children ran between the stalls. Caleb turned another page. He read of spring rides into the hills, her little girl perched on the tiny saddle, her husband steadying the reins while the child squealed with delight. He read of birthday candles lit inside the barn, of cakes balanced on rough-hewn tables, of songs sung under rafters that echoed joy back at them. Later pages darkened. Margaret recorded the harsh winter storms that rattled the roof harvests, that failed illnesses that swept through town. Yet even in those lines, there was resilience. She wrote of huddling together by the fire of neighbors who brought food of prayers, whispered with hope, even when the night stretched long. The voice on the page was simple, unpretentious. But it glowed with love, with connection, with a stubborn will to carve meaning out of hardship. Caleb read until the words blurred, not from age, but from the tears that welled in his own eyes. He set the journal aside and touched the child's saddle. His fingers traced the stitching, still neat despite the years. He could almost see it, the child climbing aboard her parents' hands, steadying her as she found her balance. Their laughter ringing as the horse beneath shifted uncertainly. The embroidered handkerchief lay soft against his palm. He imagined Margaret seated by lamplight, needle in hand, pressing patience into every thread. It was not just cloth, it was proof of care, of time willingly given to beauty, even in the face of labor and scarcity. Then he unfolded the letter. The words were blurred, but he made out enough. It was written by Margaret to her husband, who was away, perhaps working, perhaps serving. She spoke of missing him, of keeping the barn running, of their daughter's laughter filling the evenings. She ended with a line that pierced through the years: everything we need. We already have, as long as we have each other. Caleb closed his eyes. The chest in his lap was not a trove of riches. It was a time capsule of devotion, fragments of a life where happiness was measured not by wealth, but by presence, by memory, by love. For a long while, he sat unmoving, the items spread before him like relics of a faith he thought he had lost. His rough, scarred hands shook as he turned the journal's pages again, slower this time, letting the words seep in. He realized with a force that stole his breath that this barn had once been more than wood and nails. It had been the cradle of a family story. And though the walls sagged now, though the roof leaked and the floor groaned, the soul of that story lingered, waiting for someone to listen. Tears spilled hot down his cheeks. He did not fight them, because for the first time since Clara's letter, he understood. A legacy was not land. It was not cattle or money in a bank. It was not even success in the eyes of others. A legacy was the memories carved into wood, the laughter that once echoed under a roof, the love that outlasted drought and storm. And perhaps he thought it could be rebuilt. He pressed the journal shut and rested his hand on the cover. "Thank you," he whispered to the silence, though he was not sure if he spoke to Margaret Boone, to Jedediah, or to the barn itself. Ash shifted nearby, stamping a hoof softly, as though acknowledging the vow that had taken root in his master's chest. Caleb drew a shaky breath. The shame that had crushed him when he read Clara's letter still lingered, but it was thinner now, pierced by something gentler. He still had nothing of value to offer his grandchild, no inheritance, no land, no wealth. But he could build something else, a place where love and memory could live. He could pass on more than failure. His tears slowed, replaced by a fierce calm. The day was hot, the kind of heat that seemed to bake even the dust into the air. Caleb had just set aside the Boone family's journal, his mind still heavy with its words, when the sound of wheels and hooves drifted up the road. At first, he thought it another wagon rattling through town. But the sound slowed, drawing nearer, until it pulled up outside the barn. He stepped into the doorway, shielding his eyes from the glare. A wagon stood in the road, its wheels kicking up red dust. From it climbed two figures. Caleb's breath caught when he recognized them. Clara, and beside her, Matthew. Clara, now in her 20s, looked smaller than he remembered, slight, delicate in her plain dress, but her face was filled with worry. The kind of worry that wore grooves into young features too early. She carried herself with a gentleness that reminded Caleb of her mother, but her eyes wide and anxious, searched for him like a daughter searching for a father she was afraid she no longer knew. Matthew was different. Taller than Caleb had expected, broader. Through the shoulders he moved with the restless tension of a storm caged inside. His jaw was set, his dark hair plastered against his forehead with sweat. His eyes, though, were what struck Caleb most, hard, sharp-lit with both anger and something Caleb dreaded more, fear. Ash shifted near the corral ears, flattening. The Mustang's instincts picked up the tension before Caleb's heart had even steadied. For a moment, Caleb could not speak. His throat closed, his chest swelled with a dozen emotions. He couldn't sort shock, pride, longing, shame. Before he could form words, Matthew's gaze swept across the barn. His lips curled, the faintest sneer rising, as he took in the patched roof, the crooked walls, the half-cleared floor. Clara was the first to move. She stepped forward quickly, almost stumbling in her haste. Her voice trembled as she reached for him. "Dad, why here? Why are you living like this?" Her hand grasped his small and urgent. "You should come back with me. You shouldn't be out here alone in a place like this. At least with me, you'd have a real bed, a meal that isn't beans out of a can. Please." Her eyes swept the barn's interior, the rough beams, the dust still clinging in corners, the patches of mold not yet scrubbed clean. To her, it must have looked like a prison, a ruin her father had chained himself inside. "Dad," she whispered again, her voice breaking, "I need you. And the baby, your grandchild, needs you. Don't bury yourself out here." Caleb's lips parted, but no words came. His chest ached at the plea in her eyes. The reply came not from him, but from Matthew. "No, Clara," he snapped, his voice cut sharp through the hot air. "He doesn't need to come back. He needs to stop this madness." Matthew stepped closer, his face flushed. He pointed at the barn like it was an enemy. "Don't you see it? It's happening all over again. The same damn thing. The ranch, the herd, the debts. I remember it all. Don't you, Dad?" The words struck like a whip. Caleb winced. Memories surged, the collapse of fences, cattle driven off the bank, padlocking the gates. Matthew's voice rose. "I watched you stand just like this, promising it would be different. Promising it was for us. And then I watched men drive off our cattle while you stood there with your hands empty. I watched the bank take everything. You said it was hope, a project, a chance. But it crushed us. It crushed Mom. It crushed Clara. It crushed me." His fists clenched at his sides, trembling with anger that was too heavy for his young frame. "And now you're doing it again. Here, with this wreck of a barn." "You think I don't see it?" Caleb opened his mouth, desperate. "It isn't the same, Matt. It's exactly the same," Matthew roared. His eyes blazed not just with fury, but with terror. The terror of a boy who had once lost everything and now saw the nightmare returning. To him, this barn wasn't a hope reborn. It was the echo of ruin. Caleb's voice cracked as he tried again. "This time is different, Matt. I'm not chasing cattle. I'm not gambling on markets or rain. I just want to rebuild this place, to leave something even small for you. For Clara, for the baby. Something solid." "Solid," Matthew spat the word. "You call this solid dust, rot, and broken boards. You always say it's for the family. That's the excuse you hide behind. But what did it bring us? We lost everything." Matthew Clara tried to interject, tears brimming, "Don't." But he couldn't stop. His voice climbed higher, ragged with pain. "We don't need more dreams, Dad. We don't need you proving anything. We need a father. We need a man who's here, not some fool chasing ghosts in a ruin." Each word landed like a hammer blow. Caleb felt them sink deep, reopening wounds that had never healed. He staggered back a step, his breath coming shallow. Clara's tears spilled as she reached for her brother's arm. "Enough, Matt. Please." But the damage was done. The air was split with hurt that could not be unsaid. Clara turned back to Caleb, her voice breaking. I can't watch this anymore." She caught Matthew's sleeve, pulling him toward the wagon. Matthew resisted only long enough to throw one final dagger over his shoulder. "If you keep this up, Dad, you'll lose us for good. Forever." The words echoed through the barn, even after the wagon rattled away, hooves drumming into the distance, dust rising to blur their figures from view. Caleb stood rooted to the floor. Then slowly, as silence smothered the barn, his knees gave way. He sank onto the boards, his hands covering his face. The words replayed relentless. "It's happening all over again. You'll lose us forever." Each repetition cut deeper. He was back in that old moment at the day the ranch gates locked, and the day his wife walked away, the day Matthew's eyes filled with bitterness. He was back in every failure, every humiliation. Ash approached the Mustang's steps, slow, careful. He lowered his great head against Caleb's shoulder, warm breath stirring his shirt. Normally, the touch steadied him, but now even that comfort couldn't pierce the weight pressing him down. "I'm a fool," Caleb whispered into his hands. "All I do is hurt them. Maybe Matt's right. Maybe I'm nothing but a dreamer chasing wrecks." His chest heaved, the words spilling out like confessions to the shadows. A creak came from the barn's doorway. Jedediah Boone stepped inside. He had been on the porch listening to most of it, though he hadn't made himself known. Now he walked with slow, measured steps, the tip of his iron cane tapping against the boards. His face was drawn eyes heavy with the kind of understanding that comes from surviving one's own failures. He didn't speak at first. He simply lowered himself onto an overturned bucket beside Caleb. They sat together in silence, broken only by the restless snort of Ash. Caleb finally turned eyes red. "You heard." Jedediah gave a single nod. Caleb's voice cracked. "Then you know. They're right. I'm wasting my time. I should just..." Jedediah raised a hand, silencing him. Slowly, the old man reached into a canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. From it, he produced a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the floor between them and unrolled it. Inside lay tools, old, worn, but cared for, a hammer with a polished handle darkened by years of grip, a chisel with a blade still sharp, a handsaw, its teeth gleaming though its frame was nicked, pliers, a rasp, a file. Caleb stared confused. What Jedediah's voice rumbled low and certain. "Don't waste your breath on words, son. Don't try to convince them. They won't believe speeches. They'll believe work." He nudged the tools closer. "Let your hands tell your story. Build something that can't be argued with." His eyes locked on Caleb's. "You've carried the weight of ruin. I can see it. But you've still got hands that can shape wood, mend iron. Use them. Prove yourself not in talk, but in what you leave standing." Caleb's throat tightened. He reached out, fingers brushing the hammer's smooth handle. It felt solid, heavier than it should have been, though it carried not just iron, but faith. Jedediah stood then leaning on his cane. "I've nothing else to give you. Only these. But they were mine when I was your age. They built things that lasted." He turned toward the door, pausing only once. "Build it, Rowan. Let that be your answer." When he was gone, Caleb sat in the silence, the tools gleaming faintly in the slanted light. His children's harsh words still rang in his ears, sharp as broken glass. But beside them, another voice now stood, Jedediah's, firm as steel. "Let your hands tell your story." He gathered the tools into his lap, the weight grounding him, steadying him. He could not erase what had been said, but he could answer in the only way left to him: by building. The next morning, Ash stood ready, the Mustang, watching with patient intensity as Caleb measured the broken beams. From the edge of the scrubby woodland nearby, Caleb felled several small trees, straight trunks, not too wide. Ash bore the weight of dragging them back, the harness creaking as he leaned into the load with steady strength. Caleb sawed them into lengths, squared the edges, and hoisted them upright where old posts had collapsed. He lashed them with rope and hammered iron nails Jedediah had given him. It was slow, back-breaking work. Sweat poured off his brow, his shirt clung to his back, his palms blistered under the hammer's grip. His body groaned with each lift. But every time a post stood straight and firm, he felt a quiet pride pulse through him. The skeleton of the barn, once crooked and ready to fall, now rose again piece by piece. Ash helped in his own way. The Mustang-hauled beams stood calmly, while Caleb braced poles against his side and nudged him forward when exhaustion threatened to stop him. It was as though the animal understood the stakes, determined to see the work done. The roof was next. Caleb dragged out the rotted planks, tossed them down into the yard, where they shattered into splinters. Then he scaled the rafters, balanced precariously, while the wind tugged at his hat. With slow precision, he laid down new boards, hammering them into place. Where cracks remained, he smeared a mixture of clay and straw, sealing the gaps. The work reminded him of patching boots in his ranching days, tedious, but each stitch meant survival. Below, he tore out the worst of the flooring, pried up the mold-blackened boards, and laid fresh timber in their place. The barn began to change beneath his hands. The damp stink that had clung for decades faded. In its place rose the scent of new pine, sweet and alive. When the first section of roof was complete, sunlight slanted through the rafters, not as fractured gashes, but as clean squares of light. For the first time, the barn seemed to breathe again. Once the frame was solid, the roof patched, and the floor laid smooth. Caleb began to shape the barn into something more than a shelter. He wanted it to be warm, a place where Ash could stand proudly, and where a family could walk in without shame. He built a door from sturdy planks hung on hinges he had reforged over Jedediah's fire. It swung open with a creak of strength, not decay. He cleaned and set a trough where Ash could drink, filling it with fresh water from the well. Along the walls he lined pine boards, pale and golden, reflecting light, until the whole place seemed to glow. No longer did it resemble a ruin. It was not grand, not polished, but it was whole, honest and alive again. Ash walked inside, tail swishing, and gave a soft whicker. He stamped once on the clean boards, then looked at Caleb with ears pricked. Caleb laughed, for the sound was unmistakable approval. "This is home," he whispered. That evening, as he sat carving a latch for the new door, his thoughts drifted back to his boyhood. He remembered evenings on his father's porch with the rasp of a knife against wood. His father had been a quiet man, never wealthy, but with hands that knew how to coax beauty from scraps. Caleb remembered the little wooden animals his father had whittled the way he had shown his son how to follow the grain rather than fight it. One summer, when Caleb was no older than Matthew had been during the ranch years, his father had carved him a toy saddle out of pine. "There's always something waiting in the wood," his father had said, guiding Caleb's hand with the knife. "All you have to do is find it." The memory struck deep. He realized now that what he was doing with the barn wasn't just repair. It was a way of reclaiming that lost lesson, of reconnecting with the roots of who he was before failure and shame had hardened him. He was not only rebuilding a building, he was rebuilding a bond with his family, both living and gone. His thoughts turned to Clara and Matthew, and his chest tightened. He replayed the argument, the hurt in Clara's eyes, the fury in Matthew's voice. Words had failed him, but perhaps words were not what he needed. He looked down at the block of wood in his hands. "If they will not hear me, let them hold what I can make." The idea took root to carve gifts, not as payment, not as excuses, but as proof. Proof that he had listened, that he remembered, that he loved. Proof made not of promises, but of labor. For the grandchild he had not yet met, he began with something gentle. He selected pieces of light, soft wood and cut them into shapes no longer than his palm. Slowly, with patient strokes, he coaxed forms from the grain. A bear cub, round and stout, its little snout lifted in curiosity. A rabbit, long ears swept back as if in mid-leap. A fox curled into a sleeping ball tail wrapped around its nose. A bird with wings slightly spread, poised to fly. Each figure was sanded smooth until even the smallest hand could touch it, without fear of splinters. He brushed them with a thin coat of oil, enough to deepen the color, but leave the wood alive. He tied each to a string of soft twine, all meeting at a crosspiece of oak. When he hung them, they turned gently in the air. Light struck them and sent their shadows spinning across the barn walls, tiny animals dancing in sunlight. Caleb smiled, a warmth he had not felt in years swelling in his chest. "This," he murmured, "will be my first hello." For Clara, he chose walnut, dark and rich. He carved a small box, its corners joined with patient dovetail joints. On the lid, He etched a winding vine of wildflowers, the same kind she had loved to gather in her childhood. He could still see her running with a bundle clutched in her hands, laughing as petals scattered in the wind. Inside, he smoothed the wood to a satin finish polished until it shone. He fitted hinges small but sturdy. It was not merely a jewelry box. It was a reminder, I remember you. I treasure you as much as you once treasured those flowers. As he set it aside, he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. The hardest was Matthew's. Caleb knew his son had no patience for sentiment. Matthew wanted solidity, usefulness, proof that things could endure. So Caleb selected oak, heavy and unyielding. He planed and squared each board, cutting precise joints until they locked without gaps. He sanded until the edges met seamlessly, building a box large enough to hold tools of a working man. The handle was thick, carved to fit a strong grip. He forged the hinges from iron scraps, setting them firm enough to last decades. On the lid, he carved nothing but a name, Matthew Rowan. The gift carried no flourish, no poetry. It spoke only of endurance, of reliability, of work done honestly. It said, I understand. I know what matters to you. This is yours. Before him lay the three gifts: the walnut box etched with vines, the sturdy oak toolbox, the mobile of tiny animals that swayed gently in the breeze. They were finished now, polished, sanded whole. His part was done. The harder part lay ahead. He reached for the small phone Jedediah had once pressed into his hand, an old battered device, but enough for messages. His thumb hovered uncertainly above the screen. What could he say that would not sound like pleading? What words could bridge the chasm carved by years of failure? Finally, he typed, I've finished something. If you can come and see. He stared at the words for a long moment. Too little. Too much, but there was no better way. He pressed send. The tiny chime sounded louder than any gunshot. Afterward, he sat on the bench, heart hammering, waiting as if the reply might come instantly. Ash shifted nearby, lying down with a heavy thud. But his amber eyes never left his master, watching with that steady vigilance that had saved Caleb more than once. Caleb whispered, half to the horse, half to the shadows, it's in their hands now. The next 2 days were endless. He woke each morning hoping for the vibration of a reply, but the phone stayed silent. Each evening he lay down on the cot in the corner, staring into the rafters, his mind replaying the same question: had they even read it? Or had Clara seen his message, sighed, and set it aside as another one of his hopeless projects? Had Matthew deleted it outright? The waiting gnawed at him. He could not keep still. He scrubbed the trough again, though it gleamed already. He swept the floor until no mote of dust dared to settle. He adjusted the mobile over and over, testing how the animals turned, shifting them so the light fell just right. Every time, hooves clattered faintly on the road outside, his chest tightened, but each time it was only a stranger passing another false alarm. By the second night, exhaustion dragged at him, yet he could not sleep. The barn seemed to echo with silence, as though testing whether he would lose faith before the answer came. Ash nickered softly, nudging him once as he paced. Caleb stopped long enough to lay his hand on the horse's neck. Patience, boy, he whispered. Patience is all we've got left. On the morning of the third day, the sound came. Not just one set of hooves, but the steady rumble of a wagon. Caleb froze. His breath caught as he stepped into the doorway. Dust rose in the distance, sunlight flashing off iron rims. The wagon slowed, creaked to a halt before the barn. Clara climbed down first. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pinned back, her hands folded over her stomach protectively, though her belly was still flat. Her eyes darted around, wary, braced for disappointment. Matthew followed. His arms were crossed tight across his chest. Even before he hit the ground, his expression iron hard. He glanced at the barn with a look that said he expected Ruin's delusion, another failure to catalog. Caleb swallowed hard, his heart beating, as though it might break through his ribs. He stepped forward, forcing his voice steady. "Thank you," he said, for coming. At first, neither spoke. Clara's gaze flicked upward to the roofline, then to the fresh boards gleaming golden in the morning light. Her hand rose, slowly covering her mouth. Matthew walked closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. He ran a hand along one of the walls, knocking twice with his knuckles. The sound that answered was solid, resonant. No hollow echoes, no rot. His brow furrowed, the certainty of scorn faltering. The barn stood not as ruin, but as rebirth beams, straight and proud. The roof sealed the door square and strong. Light poured across the pine walls, turning the space warm and alive. The trough shimmered with clear water. Even the scent was different, fresh wood and oil instead of mold. Clara's eyes filled. "Dad," she whispered. Matthew said nothing, but his crossed arms slowly loosened. "Come inside," Caleb said softly. They stepped through the door, and silence followed. The air was cool and clean. Sunlight poured through the repaired windows, glancing off pale boards. The mobile of carved animals hung from a beam, spinning slowly, casting playful shadows across the walls. At the center of the space stood the table, and on it, the 3 gifts, polished until they glowed. The barn was no longer a place of death and dust. It breathed now, it lived, it welcomed. Clara pressed a hand to her chest. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Even Matthew could not hide his surprise. He looked around slowly, his jaw working, his eyes tracing the beams, the floor, the careful order of everything. Caleb stood beside the table, his hands trembling, as he gestured toward the gifts. "I made these," he said. "For you." He lifted the walnut box first, turning it in his hands, before offering it to Clara. "For you, daughter," he said softly. "To hold what matters most." Clara took it with careful fingers. When she traced the lid, her breath hitched. The wildflowers carved their delicate vines winding across the surface were the very ones she had once gathered as a girl. "You remembered," she breathed. Tears welled. "All these years you still remembered the flowers I used to pick." Her voice broke. She clutched the box to her chest, her tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Caleb turned then to the mobile. The tiny figure's bare rabbit fox bird twirled gently as he lifted it. "For the little one," he said, his throat tightening. A first gift from his grandfather. Clara laughed through her tears, a trembling, joyful sound. She reached out and took the mobile, her hands shaking as she held it close. Her eyes shone with hope. "He'll love it," she whispered. "I already do." Finally, Caleb picked up the oak toolbox. It was heavy in his grip, plain and solid, carved only with the name Matthew Rowan. He stepped toward his son. "For you," he said quietly. "So you'll know I see you. I respect your strength, your need for what is real." For a long moment, Matthew did not move. Then slowly he reached out and took it. His fingers ran along the seams, the joints, the grain. He pressed his thumb into the dovetail corner, tested the weight. His lips trembled. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "I was wrong, Dad." His eyes lifted, glistening. "I thought this was another dream. I thought you'd fall again and take us with you. But this?" He swallowed hard. "This is different. I see it now. I was wrong." Caleb's knees nearly buckled. His son's words, simple as they were, felt like the breaking of chains he had carried for years. Matthew set the toolbox gently on the floor, then stepped forward and threw his arms around his father. The embrace was fierce, clumsy, and utterly real. Clara joined them, folding herself into the circle, clutching the box to her chest, even as her arms wrapped around her father and brother. For the first time in years, they were not fractured individuals orbiting grief and anger. They were family. Outside, Ash lifted his head, let out a ringing whinny that echoed across the yard, as if to announce the birth of something new. The sun was sinking by the time they finally sat at the table together, the three gifts arranged between them like promises. The light turned the pine walls golden, and the barn glowed as if lit from within. They spoke of small things, at first the baby's due date, Clara's work, the neighbors she trusted. Slowly, the conversation widened. They spoke of what they had lost, yes, but also of what could yet be built. They spoke of journeys they might take together, of plans that sounded fragile, but possible. Caleb looked around him at the barn that had once been ruin, at the children who had once been lost to him. He felt a weight shift in his chest, replaced by something lighter. This was no longer a shell. It was no longer a monument to failure. It was a home. It was a legacy. From a few coins and a broken barn, he thought, I have found my family again. The sky outside burned with crimson light. Inside, the warmth of laughter and forgiveness filled the air. And so the story ended where it had begun: a poor cowboy, a loyal horse, and an abandoned barn. Only now, it was something more. Now, it was a